Every day was like a psychological battle.
While North Korea's prison camps are visible from spy satellites, we wouldn't know much about them if not for the people who escaped, both the prison camps and the country as a whole. While some of the stories and reports that these escapees have sold to the media have come under scrutiny, especially as of late, they still offer the only glimpse that we have into the hermit kingdom's most awful reality.
These and other inaccuracies do not affect the report that condemns Pyongyang.
So let's take a minute to look at the top 10 descriptions of the prison camps in North Korea as told by those who survived them.
Not camps, the education place.
Jihyun Park. The first entry on this list, as bad as her experience was one of the lucky ones. Keep that in mind. Park escaped from North Korea in her youth after her father's dying wish was that his remaining family flee North Korea. She was able to enter into China after her mother used the little money they had to pay their way past a border guard. In China, she found someone who was supposed to give her a good job. However, she was actually sold into a form of slavery upon being purchased by an alcoholic who took her in as his wife. She was forced to work like a slave for up to 16 hours a day, with the only positive in her life being the son that she had with her husband/captor. When her son was 5 years old, she was arrested and deported back to North Korea, and then sent to a prison camp where the conditions were unspeakable and she was worked like an animal. Her main job was to clear out areas to make room for farmland. The inmates weren't even allowed simple things like shoes. Because of that, Park eventually ended up with gangrene in her feet and legs from the open sores that she ended up getting from working shoeless. She only was released from the prison once her gangrene reached a level that the guards assumed she was going to die. They forced her out so they wouldn't have to deal with her body. She recovered and escaped back to China and reunited with her son, who had been left to starve by her former captor. She luckily received asylum in Britain with her son and a new husband, another defector. Fairy tale ending for a horror story. Before the horror stories continue, why not take a second to hit that subscribe button and notification bell? And now, take a deep breath because it only gets worse from here. Jeong Kwang-il. Jeong Kwang-il was a trader in North Korea that worked with the two countries along its borders, China and the loathed South Korea. China is the main ally of North Korea, but South Korea is an enemy. North Korea considers themselves still at war with their neighbor to the south, as the Korean War never technically ended. Therefore, trading with the South is against the law, and it is a gigantic no-no for those who have the nerve to engage in any sort of partnership with the South. Kwang-il was one of those people and was caught. He was accused of not only trading with the South, but also of being a spy for them as well. Soldiers beat Kwang-il so severely in an attempt to coax a confession out of him that they permanently scarred the back of his head and almost killed him. After 10 months of enduring torture techniques like the pigeon torture method, Kwang-il was sent to Yodok, one of the largest prisons in North Korea. He joined 50,000 other inmates. At Yodok, he was awakened every day at 5 a.m. and then forced to work after a meager breakfast of rice and beans and corn. Springtime meant working in the fields, but when winter came, they were forced to cut up and carry huge logs that were over 13 feet in length for more than 2 miles at a time. Most people either ended up starving to death thanks to this arduous work schedule, or some died from accidents while carrying logs that could easily crush a man. Luckily, a senior guard checked into his file and decided after 3 years that Kwang-il was wrongfully accused. Unfortunately, there was no happy ending for him, as when he returned to his family, he had discovered that his home was gone and that they had disappeared. He then fled to South Korea and still doesn't know what happened to his loved ones. Kang Cheol Hwan. Kang Cheol Hwan is the perfect example of how the system of oppression works in North Korea. Hwan's grandfather was labeled as a traitor to the people, so his entire family were sent to a prison camp when he was only 10 years old. If you thought that he'd have a better time because he was a child, you were wrong, as Hwan described the other children as basically being nothing but skin and bones like beggars. He too was immediately sentenced to carry heavy logs for hours a day for miles and miles. Beatings were routine for those that couldn't handle their share of the work, and those beatings were mostly carried out by other inmates. What differs from Hwan's account of the prison camps is that he described a prison within the prison, for people who refused to do what they were told by the guards. While all prisons have solitary confinement and holes, imagine the North North Korean version of a hole, it's as bad as you'd expect, with people being sentenced over 6 months at a time in tiny, filthy cells, which were often filled with cold and muddy water. Because of the exposure to the elements and the physical and psychological toll it took on people, few actually survived it. If you tried to escape, you were either shot or hanged. Hwan was finally released after a decade in the camp, which was half of his life at that point. Hyuk Kim. Hyuk Kim's story isn't different in terms of what he experienced, but rather how he explained the ways it all affected him as a human being. Kim was 16 when he was sent to prison for attempting to sneak into China like many people of all ages were doing, as they were literally starving to death and were looking for any help or hope. During his 3-year sentence, Kim witnessed and was subjected to some of the routine things that have propagated this list in terms of extremely hard labor, starvation, beatings, and the like. However, he was able to verbalize this experience in a way that many others couldn't or wouldn't, by saying that he felt like he lost all humanity while in the camp and stopped acting as a human, or stopped acting based on logic, but instead started to just react based on fear, like a cornered animal. That's important because that lack of humanity works both ways. You'll learn of other accounts further down this list that basically shows the guards were treating the prisoners like animals, and that disassociation is an important topic in terms of how things like this can happen. Jihyun-A. Jihyun-A, like many others near the border to China, had traveled there 3 times in her life. Each time she was caught and sent back to North Korea. The 3rd time ended in horror, as she had met someone in China and had become pregnant. Despite the alliance between the 2 countries, apparently it was against the law for women to have mixed-race children. Because of that law, Hyun-A was given an abortion against her will at the police station without any medication to ease her suffering. After that, she was sent to a prison camp where she witnessed pregnant women being beaten and crying in the night as they miscarried their children. There are other horrible accounts of this practice elsewhere on this list, but Hyun-A's story does have a silver lining, as she has since testified against North Korea, and her story has, at least in part, led to some of the sanctions against the country. The worst part is that most of the prisoners' stories will never be told, and the true number of deaths will never be fully known. The camps have been described as worse than Auschwitz. We're halfway through this list and are transitioning from the first-person stories of those that have survived the camps in North Korea to more general facts about the camps as a whole. It's important to provide some context for just how bad these camps are in terms of prisons around the world now, and also historically when compared to some of the more famous camps that we grew up reading about in history class, like the Gulag in the Soviet Union or the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. A survivor of one of history's most awful and famous camps, Auschwitz, described the conditions at the North Korean camps and the conditions that the people in them faced, and said that they were being treated worse than his experience at Auschwitz. That's important because the treatment of Jews and others in those camps was so terrible that it was the impetus for creating Israel as an independent nation, and the guilt felt by countries that ignored reports out of German territories is still felt to this day. The question is whether or not anything will be done to liberate the people in the North Korean camps, and considering the climate right now, I guess we'll find out sooner rather than later.
We're going to make a great deal for the world.
They're no fans of religion. One part of life in prison is that people are routinely executed for even the smallest grievances. In the early 20th century, when communism almost took over the world, one key element was the atheistic angle, which dominated the governments and countries that fell under the spell of Karl Marx's philosophy. While Marx said that it was just that, a philosophy, and not a blueprint for governance, most of the communist or neo-communist governments adopted Marx's loathing of religion. While that loathing varies in terms of how the governments control their people, the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, existed during the Soviet Union's heyday. North Korea appears to be on the more severe end of that spectrum. That extends to the prison camps, where people are reportedly tortured and killed on account of their religious affiliation, with officials instructed to wipe out the seed of Christian reactionaries. The amount of people in their camps rival the size of a small city. As with all things North Korea, it's hard to actually get a tab on just how many people currently or historically have been in the prison camps. Satellite photos can only show so much, and considering the immense amount of underground tunnels and facilities that the North has dug in the past century, pictures from the stratosphere can only scratch the surface. However, the most thorough and accurate estimators have tabulated that between 80,000 and 130,000 people are currently toiling away in the North Korean prison camps. While that might not sound like much much compared to the prison population in the United States, North Korea has less than 10% of the population of the US, and the prison conditions are clearly way less humane. It makes sense though, as North Korea is famous for imprisoning the entire extended families of people they deem as traitorous. Beyond that, the people that are sent to camp are actually the lucky ones, as the number of people that have been executed in lieu of prison has to be in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands since the start of the Kim regime. Despite that large number, there really are only a handful of survivor stories that we have to go on in terms of figuring out how people are treated in a country that looks at the human rights accords passed internationally and laughs. Just thank your lucky stars you weren't born in North Korea. The prisoners are starved. It's no secret that the people of North Korea have had times where their already scarce food supply has become even more scarce. After the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, for example, the financial and food support that the regime was receiving stopped, which toppled the controlled economy of North Korea. That created a famine that has defined the country, and while things are better now, with better being a relative term, food can still be a luxury. That means the people in prison aren't fed regular, complete meals. The prisoners often have to scavenge for their own food by pulling plants from whatever areas they're working in their seemingly never-ending job of moving gigantic logs to and fro. According to multiple reports, though, the prison guards don't just punish people for doing this, but they actually execute them. While that may sound like cruelty for the sake of being cruel, it may serve a purpose, as the guards could be tasked with lowering the population of the prisons so there's more food to go around. Seems like they're just punishing whomever rubs them the wrong way, which I guess is a justification, but shows you how horrible life in these camps can be and is. It's even worse for women of age. The worst stories to come out of North Korean prison camps come from those who either were with child while in the camp or those that witnessed the treatment of women who were of age. Clearly, food is a problem for everyone in North Korea and was especially bad during the famine periods that the country has had to deal with in its history. Because of the limited amount of people who have escaped and the monetary component when it comes to giving information to newspapers or television statements, it's hard to really tell if what someone is saying about their experience in the camps is true. The only way is to see if that information makes sense when applied to the information gathered from other survivors. And unfortunately, that's the case when it comes to the treatment of women who become pregnant. Because of the work involved and the time it would take for a woman to have a child, or rest before and after having one, guards often beat women to induce a miscarriage. For the unlucky mothers and babies that survive, a truly horrific death welcomes the surviving child into the world, as multiple survivors of the camps have described prison guards feeding newborn children to guard dogs. That's just the definition of the worst of humanity. Feeling a little down after this video? We don't blame you. How about a pick-me-up with some of our other videos? We promise they're usually more lighthearted. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you never miss a video.